we have to just be honest that everyone who comes to a workplace has objectives of their own, but they're also tasked with objectives for their organization or for the company. And then every person also comes to an organization with their own kind of like emotional energy and maybe sometimes baggage, maybe sometimes ambition.
No matter what type of job or work environment you've been in, you can likely relate to this. People have objectives and motivators that guide their actions. Sometimes it's intended to support the greater good of an organization or company, but it can also have an ugly side.
And I think all of that wrapped in together and how that sort of manifests itself in people's action is office politics. So I think we've all experienced at kind of one time or another, oh, well, these two people don't like each other. And so therefore you have to choose a side. So I do think office politics are kind of the combination of humans being humans at work and all that comes with that, combined with objectives and organizational dynamics of a company.
While many of us would rather avoid the office politics, the reality is that we can't. And assuming it's not necessary to understand them could put you in a situation where you're left behind. So what does it take to build that political know-how to help you get unstuck and thrive? Welcome to the Strategic Momentum Podcast, the show where we share tips, stories, and advice from progressive leaders on how to break through business and career inertia so you can better understand the business of work. I'm your host, Connie Steele. Office politics is ever present and something nearly everyone in the workplace encounters. But what those look like and their level of impact differs in each environment. So today, I've brought on a range of business leaders who can share their perspectives and experiences from different roles, industries, and company structures. These 7 guests offer insights on how to build that political competence in order to navigate the office politics effectively. Because as they will all tell you, it's not something you can sit out. Joining me today are Kimberly Henning, SVP of Enterprise Payments at Bank of America, Preston Lewis, founder and CEO of Intactic, Tony Orlando, software executive and board member to several tech companies, and Jennifer Trespass, otherwise known as JT, partner and COO of Wildcat Venture Partners, and a guest on an upcoming episode about building and sustaining effective teams. Plus, we have returning guests, Jen McDonald, Chief Client Officer at VML Y&R Agency, Jim Brady, founder and CEO of Spirited Media Consulting, and Michael Wilkinson, Master Facilitator and founder of Leadership Strategies, who will also return for another episode. Because we have so much ground to cover, we've actually broken up this topic into multiple episodes, with the first discussing the what and why, and the second and third addressing how to solve and manage those tricky political situations we commonly fall into. So in today's episode, we'll get the lay of the land by exploring what office politics really means, the positive and negative sides of it all, and most importantly, what drives the political behavior at its core. We'll start with each guest defining what office politics is based on their experiences. For Jen and Jim, it starts with understanding that it's a combination of the people and the organizational dynamics of a company, where different perspectives and processes to getting things done exist.
So I would define it as just sort of office politics, or the ecosystem by which things get done and decisions get made. And it frequently does not line up with organizational chart. There's always people on an org chart who are high up in it who have far less impact than you would think, and people farther down on it who have much more impact than you would think.
Politics in general has so many different layers to it. And it's obviously in its kind of traditional sense, when we kind of think about politics in a political sense, it's really about navigating different points of view.
For Preston and Kim, office politics is about how those relationships between people play out in company culture. And as you will hear from JT, it's often used to gain power or advancement.
The way I would define it is the interplay of relationships that happen within any kind of organizational culture. That's a very wordy way of basically saying that politics are either enabled or disabled by the culture.
It really can start with an individual, but it can evolve into the culture. And politics, from the way that I perceive it within the workplace, is really an individual interacting with others, and it can often lead to the way that the culture of the company is defined, if it is negative and tolerated, or if it's positive and encouraged. So depending upon what the angle and the purpose of the politicking is, it can really help define what a company is, both internally as well as how it's perceived externally.
But essentially, office politics is just the output of culture. And it's just a natural human behavior that is activated and generated by the culture that typically is used to gain some advantage that is going to hopefully result in a promotion, or maybe it's a new customer account or a new project. But it's definitely used to get some power or influence or advancement. And it can typically be unwritten and have an informal network associated with it. I just remember when first getting into the office environment and refusing to acknowledge office politics. But as we'll learn, it is part of the equation, and it's figuring out how we can leverage that part of the experience to help make it a more rewarding career path for and experience for people. Politics is a form of relationship management. It's nurturing relationships to help you achieve something for yourself. And that is, or to even just neutralize, but still be visible or influencing. So it really has, there is a process to it that just isn't a quick hit, because relationships aren't quick hits. And I think with leaders today, and in particular the next generation of leaders who have had a journey of working with technology that is so instant and real time and dynamic, and being able to build a skill that's about relationship management that isn't as immediate in its results, can be a challenge to have that patience and be deliberate in navigating.
And for Michael, the root of office politics really comes down to two things.
As you think about what happens inside of an office and the negative behaviors that often occur as a result of office politics, they really come down to two things in particular in our experience, and it's alignment and trust.
To understand this ecosystem, we have to get grounded in what a company's culture is like first. And what Tony and Preston collectively tell us is that there's no such thing as a culture without politics, because politics is embedded in every workplace conversation.
Everybody talks about culture today, and the reality is you can have a great culture, but most workplaces, even if they're great culturally, still have politics. So what can you do about it?
When we think about the relationship between office politics and culture, I think we first need to define what we mean by culture. One of my favorite definitions of corporate culture, company culture, is the collective conversation. And conversations ultimately influence relationships, which directly impact politics and career success. I think there's a level of understanding of the relationship between, what's happening between people and teams within the broader organization. And once you have a good understanding of the interplay, if you will, amongst those relationships, then you're well positioned to understand the level of influence that politics may or may not have on any given day. There's no such thing as an organization that isn't political. By nature, organizations are political. There are levels. I don't believe there's any such thing as a flat organization. Now, having said that, there is you can nurture a culture of a flat organization. And there's a lot of value in that, depending on the circumstance in the company and lots of other things. So again, it's more of an approach or an intention than a reality. But what that does do is it helps surface and, as I said, create time and space for dialogue. It's for conversation about what's working or what's not working, or about what priorities are, or what success looks like, or what are we all working towards. And the more time and space that is created, and therefore the more dialogue that happens, more conversation that happens, that's what good corporate or good office culture looks like in reality.
But we have to remember that politics shouldn't be perceived necessarily as negative. In fact, learning how to master it can help you create the forward momentum you are looking for in a project or even in your own professional career. The fact is, surveying and understanding the full landscape puts you in a better position to know how to be successful. Let's hear from Jen and Preston.
We're all kind of human when we get to the table, and you can and should expect nothing less. Let's say if someone is kind of new to a company and their objective is to learn as much as possible and get promoted, and maybe they're looking at a coworker and they're trying to, get in on projects, and they kind of figure out who to talk to. And, one could argue that playing off politics is actually not bad. That's just kind of like, again, that's just being logical and a human.
Well, when you come into any new organization or team, you quickly need to understand the relationships. And the more able you are, or the faster you can do that, you're in a better position to understand how to be, quote, successful. And, a lot of that success, of course, has to do with the relationships that you develop, nurture, sustain over time.
So for somebody who may be kind of somewhat still starting out in their career, not really understanding how to potentially map out the relationships and the impact that one can have on activities that occur, how would you start to help them map that out?
It's interesting. We can be very sophisticated with how we think about dynamics, politics, culture, relationships inside any work environment. But I think it's very fair to say that people that are newer to the workforce might not have the experience and understanding of what level of the sophistication may be required to quickly understand office politics. On one end of the spectrum, on the sophisticated end of the spectrum, anybody who understands or has any experience developing personas, whether they're in a marketing context or in an internal communications context, persona work really helps us understand people, understand what makes them tick, what makes them click, really understand what it is that matters to them most. That's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, if you say newer to the workforce, sometimes people have had experience with politics in another context, like in a team sport, is an interesting example. A team sport is an interesting place to think about really understanding roles and expectations and history of relationships. So I think that anybody who has had that kind of experience in any kind of team sport, you can apply similar thinking or similar dynamics when you come into an organization and you're working either individually or within a team. But back to the persona point, you do need to quickly understand ultimately, what are the concerns that people have in their role at work.
As a leader, your job is to motivate others to act towards achieving a common goal. Or as someone who has a strong belief and wants to champion that position, it requires you to influence others to see your point of view. In these cases, Tony and Michael say these are examples reflecting the positive side of politics. It's about creating the behaviors, efficiencies, and beneficial outcomes that can lead to overall success for the people and the company.
Positive side of politics is, when you really believe in something, or you unequivocally you've got the right answer, it can be a struggle to have people hear you, and then two, adopt your position, your recommendation, whatever it might be. And that's where the power of what I would call positive influence politics or influential politics comes to bear. And by the way, we see professional politicians do this all the time, right? Negotiating to get what they want in a sense, so that they can drive a behavior or a consequence that is ultimately the outcome they were striving for. So, the influential, good, strong politics can actually help get your ideas heard and enacted, in this context, in the business. But that applies to life too, Connie. Applies to home, school, friends, sports.
What are the positive sides of office politics? And you'll get the picture. Think about that you are a leader where you're wanting to get together, put together a team that is it to work on a project that's make it or break it for your company. Make it or break it. Well, due to office politics, you happen to know that there are people aligned with this particular solution. So picking people who are aligned with the success of that solution is a very positive thing to do. Picking people who are misaligned with that might not be in your best interest. So understanding the office politics around this project can make a difference between how successful the project is, and certainly how much joy, effectiveness, and efficiency the project will have. So that's an example of office politics really being used to actually achieve a positive result. Your knowledge of it makes things happen. At the same time, your knowledge of office politics can also mean that, hey, you know what? We may want to choose to put together priorities that make sure we balance the way things happen inside of the office because of the political nature. And we need to, if field operations and marketing aren't getting along, or if sales is having toughest time getting together with those engineers, then if we have a strategic ledger that's all projects that are pro-engineering have nothing to do with sales, that's going to hurt us. So being aware of those politics and using those politics to bring about positive gain can be a good thing.
So, as these guests have expressed, engaging in some form of political behavior at work is a fact of life. It's an inevitable part of being in the workforce. It can help you when you want to build relationships, be heard, move projects along, or advance your career. But we all know too often when certain dynamics in an organization become detrimental, both to the people involved and the company's bottom line. So I asked everyone to talk about the common negative situations emanating from those office politics. And for Jen and Kim, these situations don't necessarily stem from what's being said, but rather what's not being said.
I think the negative behaviors, political behaviors that exist in the workplace are when people are not transparent about what their motives are. And I can understand when people are not transparent about their motives, when maybe they don't even know what they are themselves, where they haven't quite articulated them or even maybe know why they want to do a certain thing. I think kind of negative things exist when people are not transparent about kind of why they're making the decisions that they're making. I mean, I work at an agency, and as an agency, we get to work with lots of different organizations, and so we see a myriad of political environments. And the clients that I feel like are maybe have the kind of least amount of quote unquote negative office politics are the ones that are that much more transparent about what their objectives are and why they're making particular decisions. And I think that at least makes people know what game they're playing. I feel like when it is negative, is when you're not quite sure what game you're playing, where people say that one thing is their objective when it's really something else. When people say they want to do one thing when they really are planning on doing another thing. I feel like that just creates more of a culture of kind of wasting sort of time and energy and negativity.
The word that comes to mind is subversive. That individuals are using their relationships and their influence to be subversive across the organization to get what they want when they want it. So with subversiveness, it's usually for individual gain. And when somebody will go around another individual who might actually have responsibility for something, or potentially lobby other individuals within the organization to overturn potentially something that had already been discussed and agreed to between groups, are some of the examples of behaviors that certainly I've witnessed. Unfortunately, at some points, especially early in my career, maybe I was a part of and didn't really understand what I was doing. But a lot of times, there's a follow the leader where you see somebody doing it, and you understand or you think that is acceptable behavior, and then I think that's where your mores and your ethics come into play to help you understand, or they get you, or you feel that what you are doing isn't necessarily right or necessarily the most transparent way to interact with your colleagues.
The lack of transparency around motives and subversive behavior can create a challenging work environment. And Michael Wilkinson agrees that politics happen when people aren't on the same page. It's that misalignment and lack of trust that can manifest in really detrimental ways.
And so let me just say what I mean about those two. See, when you and I are aligned, when I know that your values match my values, or when I know that what you're trying to achieve, your outcomes that you're trying to achieve align with my outcomes, guess what goes away? Politics, because we're trying to work together to achieve the same thing. And so a key cause to office politics is misalignment. When you have sales wanting to do one thing, marketing wanting to do another thing, field operations wanting to do another thing, and then people align with one of those three areas, and then the politics happen. The other really things that happen, the way we define office politics, is around trust. Because where there's a breakdown in trust, regardless of the reason, when there's a breakdown in trust, politics happen. I can't trust you, so now I have my favorite people, my blonde-haired child that I want to use all the time for everything because I can trust him or her. Or we have our favorites. We have this, we have that, because there are others we can't trust. Or people wondering why they can't get ahead because I can't trust you, however I define trust.
When you play favorites, as Michael mentioned, there's going to be some fallout as the internal competition begins, alliances or cliques form, and people start choosing sides. Yet another root cause of negative political dynamics in the workplace may even be the type of performance structure that exists. Jen and Tony talk about the system, power dynamics, and workplace cliques and what happens in those cases.
We have to just be honest that everyone who comes to a workplace has objectives of their own, but they're also tasked with objectives for their organization or for the company. And then every person also comes to an organization with their own kind of like emotional energy and maybe sometimes baggage, maybe sometimes ambition. And I think all of that wrapped in together and how that sort of manifests itself in people's action is office politics. So I think we've all experienced at kind of one time or another, oh, well, these two people don't like each other. And so therefore, you have to choose a side. Well, that has nothing to do maybe with the organization, but that just shows that we're all human beings at work. So I do think office politics are kind of the combination of humans being humans at work and all that comes with that, combined with objectives and organizational dynamics of a company. You know, I had a friend who worked for a kind of large financial services organization, and they had a stack ranked system where essentially every manager had to rank their employees. Like, let's say you had a team of 3 people, and you were forced every year to say who was number 1, who was number 2, and who was number 3. And what ranking you were dictated your raises and your kind of upward trajectory. Well, it's not surprising that over time, it created a culture where coworkers didn't want to praise each other, right? Because you don't really want to put a spotlight on your peer when you know that you are competing with said peer. Why would you do that? That just is actually it's actually quite logical in sort of behavior. But over time, this system, which was created with the best intent of finding top talent, created an environment, because we're all human beings and we're kind of in some ways acting quite logically, where people were stabbing their peers in the back, where they weren't working together as integrated teams because they wanted to make sure that their kind of stack ranking at the end of the day, they were competing with these people. They weren't rewarded for collaborating. There was no room to have 2 number 1s. There was only room to have 1. So I think those are the types of things, I guess, even when we talk about root causes, we have to remember that sometimes the root cause is kind of the structure that we put in place, and then add human beings to that structure, and then look at where rewards come from and where punishment comes from. And sometimes you can see very clearly where kind of political behavior can emerge.
Just like in school, elementary school, middle school, high school, cliques tend to develop in the workplace also. Male, female, different groups, different interests, whatever it might be. And if you're politically astute, you may be floating across cliques and being nice to everybody and professional with engaging with everybody. And, not being committed to a clique, that people on the clique may look at you and say, she's not one of us, or he's not one of us. So let's just say there's a cool piece of work in play, right? And you've got interest in it. You voiced it in the meeting, and trying to find out you don't get that piece of work that really would have challenged you and you felt would have been fun to work on. You learn later that a couple of people in that clique that you just don't hang with went to the boss and suggested in negative and influential ways that maybe you weren't the best person for that task, or even to say, hey, I was talking to Connie in the break room, and she said the last thing she wanted to do was work on that task, and it undermines you. That's an example of what I would call clique politics in the office.
What's the root causes of that? Why do you think people do that?
Jealousy, insecurity are probably the big 2 drivers. And then when you talk about groups of people, it's social, right? Wanting to fit in with that group, with that clique. It's kind of peer pressure in many ways.
One's own emotions and the behavior that emanates from them is a root cause of office politics. In fact, the topic of emotions when it comes to creating inertia in a business environment is something we've covered in previous episodes if you'd like to check it out. Episode 6, Emotions and Fear, its impact on business momentum in you, and Episode 9, Emotions are motivators, not just business momentum inhibitors, with Dr. Mary Lamia. But before we get into that, Jen McDonald brings up another great point about how unfavorable behaviors are emulated when they result in some sort of success or reward, which only exacerbates the problem.
Now, I think what is interesting is we can't forget that will look around and see what makes people around them succeed. And if they observe that what makes people around them succeed is kissing up to a particular person, or what makes people around them succeed is throwing somebody under the bus, or what makes them succeed is stealing somebody's ideas, then I think that people at some point will either decide to go somewhere else, or they will follow those behaviors. And, I think I've worked at a lot of places. I've worked with a lot of places, and it's just amazing to see the variability in negative behaviors. But usually negative behaviors will be perpetuated if they work, if that makes sense. Someone told me once that to think of people in an office like an iceberg, and what you see is really only the tip of the iceberg, but there is a ton beneath the surface. And those things, and we can't forget that how someone shows up in an office is the result of what is underneath the surface. And underneath the surface are so many things. They are kind of what is that person's makeup as a human being, that person's intrinsic motivations. That's why that person is in the industry in the first place. So I really feel like there's that people do show up in offices, and they're still people, and we have to remember that. So it's a weird answer to say that the root cause of office politics is that people work in offices and not robots. Like, I think that is the root cause of it. I also believe that generally people follow their leaders, and that becomes clear as well. And so if you have, let's say, a company leadership team that is stabbing each other in the back, and they're jockeying for position, and they don't get along, that will affect and infect the rest of a company. Maybe not right away, but eventually, because people will continue to do the things that they're rewarded for, and they will stop doing the things that they're coached not to do. And so if the leadership of an organization is highly fractured and or political, then the rest of the organization will be too. But even if you had the most harmonious leadership team, there'll still be politics, because people are inherently human and have different motivations, and we inherently kind of might be competitive, or want to win, or want to get ahead and want to succeed, or have to work around people who aren't good. I think that's just life.
As Jen tells us, we have to remember that we're all human, because how one shows up reflects what's going on underneath, of which many may not have any visibility into. It's also important to consider not picking sides and following the leader. Michael explains how this factioning is problematic.
Office politics can lead people to not buy into something just because of where they're sitting. It's funny because we talk about politics in this era of heavy politics among Democrats, Republicans, and so on. We see how politics really plays such a role in helping our government just slow down to a crawl, having our government make worse decisions. As people say, where do I stand? Well, it depends on where I sit. That is office politics in a phrase. That whether something's effective or not effective, whether it's a good decision or a bad decision, if that depends on where you sit and how you're aligned, we have a problem in our organization.
Tony, Jen, and Michael started to hint towards some of the real drivers of political behaviors: fear and insecurity on an individual level, and power dynamics, leadership affiliation, and reward structures on a company level. So let's unpack these issues, because the only way to move forward toward a solution is to understand the why behind everything. First, we'll get personal. Kim and I talk about emotions and how much they impact people's behaviors when there isn't a level of objectivity involved. And then JT and Jim dig deeper into what those prominent negative emotions are. The conclusion is that fear and insecurity really do impact organizations broadly and deeply. And as individuals, it comes from this need to feel included, validated, have purpose, and power. There's this analysis that you have to do. You have to determine what's the root cause or the drivers, or really what's the motivator behind somebody's actions. Could it be emotional? Really could be something that is related to a goal that they need to hit. It's trying to almost get into the other person's head so that you can try to assess this a bit more objectively, which I think in many instances, when these things happen, most people react very emotionally, which then can stir the pot even more.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, and that's a fabulous point, Connie, because the emotional response to a political maneuver, let's call it that, is something that will not get you to where you want to be. It's completely human. It's completely natural reaction, because a lot of times things that are done politically or seem to have these political motivations do have emotion behind them. So when you're meeting emotion with emotion, you're not going to get to any type of positive outcome, no matter how you do it, unless you have some type of an intervention. And of course, you don't want to get to that path. So it really is being an objective evaluator of, wait, what just happened? Think about, what could I have done? Is there anything I could have done? And this isn't a placing of blame. This is just an introspection so that you can then equip yourself with the non-emotional response to address the situation that you may find yourself in.
There is negative behaviors that can be fueled by being stubborn or out of fear. There's ego and competitiveness, and it definitely can create some of that negative political behaviors, such as the backstabbing or the gossiping or manipulation. There's exclusion. One of them that was dear to me was that could be viewed as negative political behavior is about women not supporting women. I am no organizational behaviorist expert, psychologist, but I would say insecurity is pretty much at the core of it. And everybody does have some degree of insecurity in us. And so essentially, it is just human nature that creates this. And there has been relationship management or political maneuvering in our life well before we've gotten into the office. And that could be from your school, your community, your social clubs, your mommy groups, and even now through technology. As individuals, we crave a feeling of being needed, included, validated, having a purpose, craving power. These are all things we all have, a craving for as humans, and we also have insecurity. And depending on which company you go into, there's degrees of political savviness that exists within companies. That culture creates those boundaries of which you try to figure out how do you survive and then thrive. In that, it's a combination of your journey and your EQ that you've established over your lifetime, coupled with the cultural elements of a company, and then the IQ as well of the individual that creates this formula of politics. And that's, I think, the root cause is human nature.
Some of it just starts hierarchy of needs. I mean, people need to have, there are people who are in a position where they can't afford not to have the job they have, literally, and they need the salary, and the fear of losing that salary or having to change jobs, cascades a whole bunch of other fears. So I think a lot of times it's not somebody wakes up in the morning and says, who can I screw over today? I don't think the world is full of that many full-on sociopaths. But I think there are people who do it because they recognize that, there might be a reorg coming up soon, and of the three of us, maybe only two of us are going to make it through the reorg, and I got to make sure I'm one of the two. So I don't know that's necessarily even, and I'm against anybody else. It's just I'm for me, and so it becomes more of a selfishness thing, but often rooted in not unfair things like needing a salary and needing money to raise your family. And so, it's my nicest way of putting it is I don't think people are doing it necessarily for terrible reasons, but I do think sometimes people get insecure and decide that, boy, my boss needs to know every single thing I do. And on top of that, he needs to know that I'm doing them well. And on top of that, they need to know they need to know I'm doing them a little bit better than the other guys. And that's where I feel like it starts to get a little dangerous when you start taking other people out.
Insecurity about where you stand leads to fear that you could lose your position or rank, salary, or even your reputation. So people act in ways that help them regain that security. Preston adds that what people do in those cases really all comes down to two innate human desires.
On the very highest level, the way we think about this is human beings, which of course, organizations are made up of human beings, right? People at work. Human beings really, and I didn't make this up, but we know this to be true, only care about two things. The first is looking good or not looking stupid. That's another way to really define it. The second thing that we as human beings care about, whether we're at home or at work, just in general, again, consciously or unconsciously, is being loved. And so when we apply that thinking to work and to culture and to office environment and politics, we first look at, well, if we know that this person, of course, wants to look good, we all do, or not look stupid, what are those things? What are those concerns, as I said earlier, that we need to be aware of so that we can ensure that they have the information that they need to respond to a question in a leadership context? Or if we're working with folks and they may be clear that there's maybe a skill set that they need to complete a task that they don't have, we need to join them in that thinking and really acknowledge, well, that might be a concern of theirs. So how do we balance out what we might need to bring to the table to get something done? So ensuring and enabling that folks are never in a position, or we as human beings at work are never in a position of looking stupid, is always a good lens to apply. And then secondly, the piece around being loved at work. What is it that makes any relationship healthy? Again, in any context, it's communications. It's feeling heard. And we like to define belonging, or in some cases as simple as being loved, as an opportunity to be heard or listened to. So if we can also employ a bit of empathy and ensure that there's time and space for people to be heard in a one-on-one context or in any context, then we know that we're heading in the right direction to develop deeper and better relationships and help manage those politics.
This need to belong ties directly into that notion of fear, because if you feel like your status is at risk, you're going to behave in a way to protect it. And if a good employee or leader is constantly fearful that their job is in jeopardy, it might be a sign that there's something wrong with the organization and not so much the individual. Of course, no one ever wants to be in a position where they look stupid. So having that awareness of what can create this concern among others is a good lens to always have. Yet, a corporate culture can foster all these bad behaviors. Regardless of the size of the organization or company, negativity often starts at the top. But it's always important to understand the landscape at the individual and work environment level, as Kim tells us. And at the end of the day, however, you have to have self-awareness to realize what will work and won't work for you.
So I think that you can look at that from two different perspectives. One is, well, the person, and this could be a small organization or a large organization. It could be, standing up a new department, for instance, or building a new team. One is, what do you want the environment to be? as the individual who is building or growing. What are the behaviors that you want to instill in your teammates that will help bring that culture to life that you're looking for? And some of this, especially in the smaller organizations, it really starts with the founder. In larger organizations, it's a little bit different because typically there's a culture that is established. So as you're going into a new organization, when you're talking with folks, whether it's your hiring manager or colleagues that you would be working with, extended team members that you have the opportunity to do your own due diligence on around the culture, Glassdoor sometimes is hit or miss to get some information about what that culture at the organization that you're looking to join is. But essentially, just decide what it is that you want to be a part of. Who are you? Are you someone who thrives in that political type of environment, and you really like to always have to jockey? It would be challenging to be successful in an environment is one that's been truly identified as being toxic, unless there is change that is going to be directed from the top down and certain behaviors identified, and the fact that those behaviors would not be tolerated. And it's something that wouldn't happen overnight. It's really, there's observation, but a lot of due diligence. And at the end of the day, being true to who you are. If you want to be a transparent person who has honest communication, that is the reputation that you will develop.
When there is toxic leadership, the ripple effect becomes a sustaining force in office politics because the heads of a company set the tone. And when that tone favors individualism over trust, transparency, and accountability, then power struggles will exist and lead to business inertia. Addressing the politics can't be solved by simply focusing on or revisiting company values. You have to demonstrate what the right behaviors actually look like based on those values. Preston explains.
The values set behavioral expectations. The right work happens when you move beyond the work. You move beyond the values themselves, and you really talk about what do those behaviors look like in action. But also understanding that whatever the values are that sit within a culture, sit within an organization, there are three behaviors that need to exist before those values ever see the light of day. Those behaviors are trust, transparency, and accountability. And if those three things, those behaviors are not being reinforced and supported by leaders, but within the leadership bodies, people, managers in particular, those day-to-day, those folks that see that activity and see that behavior day-to-day, if there's not an environment where that bad behavior is being called out and acknowledged, and if people managers are not holding everyone accountable for that bad behavior, that's when culture and trust crumbles and politics becomes bad, negative, and politics becomes strengthened, really. So that's the right work to do and the right way to approach it. Not easy at all. But what we find is when we're working with organizations that are dealing with negative behavior, negative culture, the first place we go is, well, what kind of expectations are you setting for your managers? And very importantly, not to be so crude or blunt, but we also know that in an organization, we like to say that the fish rots from the head. If leaders are not walking that talk and the accountability does not exist within leadership for that good behavior, if they're not holding each other, if leaders aren't holding each other accountable and calling out the bad behavior and having dialogue about it when they see it, then ultimately we know that people managers are going to follow suit and they're not going to be doing or be acting or behaving differently than leadership.
One of my other guests, actually a few of them, have made that comment that for many people in the organization, they commonly follow the leader's behavior. So obviously you cited too, is that if the leader is exhibiting a certain kind of behavior in which it can be toxic, or it is really all about their organization benefiting or themselves benefiting, and there's no reward if you're not really exhibiting behavior and actions that support everyone, that unto itself starts to create some really, really bad behavior, or really bad outcomes, I should say. In those situations, which tend to be quite common, I think it's something that you see in every organization in every size.
Accountability is both a cause and a cure when it comes to office politics. Walking the walk, talking the talk in a positive, beneficial, and consistent way paves the path for others to do the same. Yet, when accountability doesn't exist and negative behavior is tolerated, the subsequent implications can yield toxic outcomes. As a final point, Jen McDonald takes the analysis one step further to discuss how a company's values and reward structure sets the standard for behavior. It comes down to what leadership values and how it defines and incentivizes success.
I think at the end of the day, every organization has to think about kind of what values they have and kind of what type of behavior they want to incentivize. And frankly, there's probably plenty of organizations that want to create a particular environment that might also have side effect of negative office politics. Like you might have an objective of the company to, that doesn't involve employees integrating with one another. And it's really all about kind of like massive, competition. Maybe you're running you could be running a sales organization, et cetera. But like, I think the key is kind of at the top, trying to understand who do we want to be? What behaviors do we value? And then how will we reward those behaviors? And then how does that manifest itself into being a political or apolitical environment? So you have to assume that people are going to want to succeed. You have to assume that people are going to want to be promoted. You have to assume that people are going to want to be recognized. So what does that mean in whatever kind of system you've put in place? So back to that example that I gave before, it's like if you are trying to create a collaborative environment, but then that is dependent upon top talent, and then you put a system in place where every manager can only have one person with top talent, and that's the person who's going to get a raise every year, you have to assume that the natural human thing for people to do would be to not collaborate. Like that just makes sense because everyone's going to kind of want to be competing, not collaborating. Similarly, if let's say you wanted to like maximize, a sales goal individually among 3 people, and you want to stack order rank them, and the person who maximizes it first gets the most money, that actually might make a ton of sense to kind of put that in place. But in that case, you actually want competitive behavior, and you're putting in an incentive that, enables that. And maybe there's some politics that go around it, but it kind of makes sense.
Just like JT, when I first started my career, I also wanted to avoid office politics. To me, it was a dirty word. I saw it as people engaging in unfavorable behaviors and unkind actions, specifically for the purposes of their own gain in whatever way possible. But it wasn't until I had experiences where those political activities had direct implications on me that I learned the importance of paying attention to and understanding the full landscape. And so this is a topic that I have a lot of personal passion for. And as we've all learned, politics is a fact of life, and it's something that we deal with not only on the professional front, but the personal one as well. Realize that it's an ecosystem, that network of relationships that have power centers and points of influence where decisions get made. And these are all tied to a company's culture. Yet, what drives these negative behaviors we commonly see are some fundamental emotions of which you can relate back to a person's hierarchy of needs. No one wants to look stupid, and everyone wants to be loved. but the type of structure that's in place, whether it be the reward system or management hierarchy, can also create challenging dynamics. And a toxic environment can easily occur when corporate cultures don't prioritize accountability, transparency, and trust. So the more we understand what our own political landscape is like, where it comes from, and how to solve for it, which we will be discussing with all of our guests in part 2 of this topic, the better we'll be at managing conflict and getting to resolution. At the end of the day, everyone is human, and both employees and leaders need to understand that. Thanks for listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast. I'd like to thank Preston Lewis, Kimberly Henning, Tony Orlando, JT, Jen McDonald, Jim Brady, and Michael Wilkinson for joining us today. To connect with these guests, head to strategicmomentum.co/episodes/68 to get their details and contact information. There, you'll also get show notes, links, and more tips and advice from this episode, and you can find all the content from our past shows. If you've liked what you heard, please share this episode with a friend. And if you want to get more in-depth insight into how emotions tie to you and your business advancement, check out episode 6, Emotions and Fear, its impact on business momentum in you, and episode 9, Emotions are Motivators, Not Just Business Momentum Inhibitors, with Dr. Mary Lamia. And make sure to tune in to part 2 and 3 of this topic, where our guests will share their tips and advice on how to manage and solve for those political situations we commonly run into. What we'll learn is that leaning into emotional intelligence is the key to building relationships based on trust and inclusivity. But it's a skill you have to develop. And we'd love for you to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And follow Strategic Momentum on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn, and join the Strategic Momentum Facebook community. I'm Connie Seal, and you've been listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast.